I should have realized that the evening my sister asked me for the house keys was not a small administrative request but the first careful tug on a thread she intended to unravel, because the kitchen smelled like baked chicken and lemon polish the way it always did after Mom cleaned. Brent's football game murmured in the next room. And Ashley wore the kind of smile that looks generous from across the table yet tightens around the eyes when you're close enough to see it. She leaned forward, voice low and confident, and said she thought Mom would sleep better if Brent and she had a set of keys, since I was so often busy with my jobs and late calls. I set my glass down and watched the ice settle as if I could buy time with silence, because those keys had never been just metal to me. They were an old agreement I made with myself after Dad died and the roof began to leak, a vow that if the furnace failed at midnight or a storm pushed water under the back door, I would come without complaint, and the house would never wait long for help. Mom, trying to keep the peace, told me not to be upset and added that Ashley lived closer, even though across town is not closer than 10 minutes away, not if you count the number of times a pair of hands actually shows up. Brent called from the couch that it made sense, that he could handle bills and online forms, and I felt something hollow open in my chest at how easily years of late-night fixes and stubborn insurance calls could be rebranded as hassle. But I nodded anyway, because arguing with Ashley in front of Mom always turned me into the unreasonable one, and I laid the keys on the table where they clattered against Dad's old wood like a tiny gavel, a sound that made Ashley's smile brighten in triumph as if a verdict had been reached. Dinner slid by in that careful, brittle way families develop when everyone knows a subject is too sharp to touch, and when the plates were cleared Ashley drew a brown envelope from her bag, placed it between us with the calm of a hostess setting down dessert, and said there were a few forms to make things easier for Mom, nothing dramatic, just power of attorney, account access and medical directives so we would never need to scramble. Which was how she framed every move, as a kindness that required our compliance to keep things smooth. I unfolded the papers and felt my jaw tighten at the bold type, power of attorney, and the neat lines where agents were named, because there were Ashley's and Brent's names with clean little boxes checked, and there was no line waiting for mine, and Mom, catching my expression, said not to make it a big deal, that Ashley had explained, that it would spare me time and worry. And I heard in her voice how tired she was of being the battlefield between us. I wanted to list every weekend patching drywall and every invoice I fronted when her pension arrived late, to remind them of the winter the furnace coughed itself into silence, and I slept on the floor by the vent so the pipes wouldn't freeze, but I knew the script, raise your voice and you become the problem, so I folded the papers, slid them back, and told Ashley I would read everything carefully. Which made her relax in that way people do when the door they needed you to crack is finally open. As I left, the envelope heavy in my hand, I understood that none of this was precaution and all of it was positioning, that keys were never about doors and forms were never about safety, and that in our family, distance wasn't measured by miles but by whoever sounded more certain when they said the word responsible. And at that table I had just watched certainty win the first round. What I couldn't know then, standing on the porch with the porch light buzzing and mouth wings tapping the glass, was how quickly she would move while I was still telling myself there was time to think, because 2 days later I would learn that patience can look like surrender to someone who doesn't intend to wait for your consent. 2 days after the keys changed pockets, I walked into Mom's kitchen with a sack of groceries and a new porch bulb and felt the air shift as soon as the door clicked shut, because instead of the TV humming and coffee percolating I heard Ashley's measured voice and Brent's low replies, and when I rounded the corner they were at the table with a fan of bank documents spread out like a map to a destination they didn't plan to show me. Ashley's pen resting exactly where a signature line would be. And Brent wearing that relaxed, spectator look of a man who believes the outcome is already scripted. She greeted me with a brightness that arrived a second late, the way a practiced smile does when it has to be assembled, and she said they were just reviewing options to reduce stress for Mom, nothing binding, merely access and automatic payments so things wouldn't slip through the cracks, then angled a page away from my view as if she were tucking in a child's blanket. I set the groceries down carefully, reached for the nearest sheet anyway, and saw online access authorizations and contact changes that placed Ashley first, Brent second, and me nowhere at all. Mom sat at the end of the table with her hands folded like a tired schoolgirl, and when I asked if she had requested these changes, she said Ashley promised it would keep things simple, that at her age simplicity mattered, and I heard the tremor in her voice that meant she wanted me to let it go so the evening could pass without new bruises, and I understood, but I also saw how Ashley had swapped the word control with comfort, and made the trade palatable. Brent leaned back, crossed his arms, and said someone had to keep track while I worked unpredictable hours, and Ashley, meeting my eyes with a serenity sharpened to a point, told me that trust would make this easier, that nothing here threatened my role, and that we were on the same side, which is a thing people say when the paperwork proves otherwise. I returned the page to the stack and said if everything was so harmless then I would review all documents before anything was signed, which she agreed to with theatrical calm, even as a flicker of frustration crossed her face like a cloud skimming a lake. That night, I used the login Mom had given me years ago when late fees spooked her, and the changes blinked back from the screen with bureaucratic neatness. New email on file, new recovery phone, a secondary contact removed as if the system itself were tidying an untidy household, and there was the cold certainty I'd been resisting, because Ashley hadn't asked for my blessing and never planned to. She had simply paved around me until the road no longer touched my door. I closed the laptop and sat in the quiet kitchen, counting breaths the way Dad taught me when a stubborn bolt refused to turn, because anger is a blunt tool that strips threads and ruins parts you might still need, and I realized that a direct fight in front of Mom would only feed the story Ashley had been writing for months, that I was reactive and unreliable and too proud to accept help, which meant the better contradiction would be a long, clean record and a steady hand. But resolve does not soften the hurt, and the worst part was seeing how easily words like simpler and safer can be draped over someone you love until they stop trusting the strength they still possess. And as I turned off the lights and stepped into the night, I understood this wasn't a disagreement over process, but a campaign carried out in small, bloodless steps, and I told myself I would move quietly, document everything, and give the truth time to grow its roots, even as a part of me feared that by the time truth ripened there would be nothing left to save. The next morning the phone rang with a number I recognized and a tone I didn't, and before the coffee reached my lips a voice from the bank would turn suspicion into fact with a sentence about a power of attorney I had signed, a thing I knew in my bones I had never touched. The banker's voice was polite in the way people are when they're trained to keep storms out of small rooms, and she said she needed to confirm details on the power of attorney I had executed for my mother last week because a few items required clarification. And when I told her I had signed nothing, she paused long enough for the fluorescent hum above her desk to sneak into the silence. Then said the document bore my name and a signature that matched records, and perhaps I should stop by if there was any confusion. I drove there with my hands locked at 10 and 2 and the taste of metal behind my tongue. In a glassed-in office a manager slid a folder toward me like a tray in a cafeteria, and there it was, letterhead crisp as new bills, notary stamp neat as a wedding ring, and at the bottom a version of my name that might have fooled anyone who hadn't watched it flow out of my wrist 1,000 times, the cross on the T, too careful, the slant of the H, tight and joyless, the whole thing an excellent counterfeit and a poor imitation. Which is the paradox of fakes, they dazzle the distant eye and just offend the one that knows. He asked if I wanted to open a fraud case and warned that relatives might be questioned, and I said yes because names on paper are nothing if they do not call the right people when pressed, and I left with copies, the edges sharp against my palm, and the uneasy knowledge that somewhere between a kitchen and a clerk's counter my sister had begun speaking for me publicly. By afternoon I was at Mom's with the folder under my arm and anger in my throat I refused to let out, because Ashley and Brent were exactly where I expected, in the kitchen as if it were theirs, mail fanned like feathers, and I laid the pages down and asked which of them wanted to explain, and Ashley said it was for Mom's protection, and Brent suggested I might have forgotten, and Mom flinched at the word fraud, as if sound alone could bruise, and I realized Ashley's real craft was not signatures but tone, the soft assurances women sometimes use on frightened animals, the soothing cadence that turns theft into care. I gathered the papers back up because fury would be evidence against me and documentation would be evidence for me, and I told Ashley she had made a mistake and I would prove it, and her smile thinned in the middle the way bridges do when the river swells. But she said nothing because triumph doesn't like the shape of doubt. 2 days later I pulled into the driveway and saw the next move planted in the front yard like a flag, the post white and the rectangle red and the letters simple enough for passing children to read, "For sale." And I stood on the gravel with the sun on my neck and remembered the summer Dad taught me to set a nail with 2 easy taps before the drive, because that small patience keeps the wood from splitting. And I understood in a way that hurt that my sister believed she had found the grain of our family and intended to split it clean through. I went inside to the scent of furniture polish and the sight of a staged living room where our crooked photos had been leveled into a lie, the realtor's folder on the coffee table, Ashley's fingers steepled in ownership, Brent's nod rehearsed, and Mom's small in her chair, her eyes fixed on the window as if the house might float away if she blinked, and I said the decision was not hers to make alone and certainly not theirs to make without me. And Ashley told me the papers were filed, the market was strong, and this would give Mom security, and I saw how the story had evolved, from help to protection to inevitability, which is the arc of every quiet coup. I left without touching the sign, because ripping it out would give Ashley the scene she needed, and instead I drove home and laid the counterfeit beside the clean samples of my real name and began a ledger of dates and phrases and witnesses, and when the county mailed me, days later, the recorded deed bearing a forged version of me, I understood that the fight was no longer about being believed but about making denial impossible. The deed arrived in an envelope so ordinary I almost set it aside with coupons and pizza menus, but when I unfolded the page and the county seal winked up at me like an eye that had already seen too much, I felt the room tilt, because recorded across the top was the transfer that should never have existed. The property that held our winters and arguments and laughter sliding on paper from my mother's care toward a trust designed by my sister, and at the bottom sat that careful counterfeit of my name again, tidy as a school assignment, and wrong in every place that mattered. I took it to an attorney whose office I had remodeled years ago, a man who had seen me sweating on ladders and knew that patience is a form of strength, and he studied the signature the way carpenters study a crack to learn which way a beam will fail, then said what I needed to hear, that a forged deed is not a document but a crime, that a sale built on it collapses at the first real push, and that if we chose to press, consequences would ripple outward in court and at bank counters and across dinners where people prefer to pretend nothing serious is happening. We agreed to build quietly, because noise helps liars and records help truth, so I photocopied and scanned, I requested logs from the bank, I printed messages where simplify became a cudgel and safety became a leash, and each night I stacked paper the way I have always stacked lumber, with weight distributed and corners squared, until the pile had the confidence of a wall. Meanwhile, at the house, a stream of strangers walked through rooms my father painted, and the realtor lifted her hand toward the light in the kitchen as if she were revealing a sunrise she had invented, and Ashley followed with polished sentences about great bones and solid schools, and Brent nodded in the manner of men who want credit for applause. I did not interrupt their showings, because every polite couple touring the living room while I took photographs from the sidewalk was an additional witness to the fact of the sign, the preparation, the timeline, and when I knelt by Mom's chair on a quiet Wednesday and told her softly that she did not have to say yes to the future someone else was arranging, that security is not a place you move to but a net of people who already hold you, I saw a flicker of recognition pass through her fatigue. A little spark that said the story Ashley told had not burned away everything inside. Still, isolation is a tool, and my sister wielded it expertly, keeping conversations short when I arrived, promising Mom peace if she avoided conflict, translating my care into interference and my insistence into pride, yet in her speed she also began to skip the small careful steps that make fakes look ordinary, and that vanity is what opened the door. The notary with a timestamp that didn't match the day I was supposed to have been present, the metadata on a scanned form that tied back to a device Brent used for his side work, the email to the realtor forwarded from Mom's account at an hour she was asleep with her phone on the charger in another room. When my attorney said we had enough to freeze things, I felt the first breath of real air in weeks, not because victory was guaranteed but because the structure I had been building finally stood on its own, and we chose the moment with the care of people who understand that timing is part of truth, which is how I found myself walking into a celebration dinner Ashley arranged for buyers she called the perfect fit. A phrase that stuck in my throat like a splinter, my folder under my arm and a calm on my face I had borrowed from my father for the night. At the table, with peach cobbler steaming and small talk rattling, I waited for Ashley to lift her glass and declare the future settled, because a person who believes their story is airtight always asks for applause, and when she did, I placed the recorded deed beside the notarized contract with my unsteady counterfeit, then set down the samples of my real signature and the letter from the bank investigator. And the room changed shape in an instant, the buyers lowering their forks, the realtor calculating exits, Mom's eyes widening with a dawning that hurt and healed in the same second, and Ashley's mouth making the small round "oh, liars" where the first time a door refuses to open. I did not raise my voice at that table, because truth does not need volume to land, it needs sequence and weight. So I walked through the pages the way I walk someone through a house I've framed, beginning with the footings, dates and authorizations, and moving carefully up the studs, access changes and notarizations, until I reached the roofline where a recorded deed tried to keep out the weather but failed under the pressure of a forged name. And throughout it Mom's hand tightened around her napkin and the buyers glanced at each other with the embarrassed look of people who wandered into a family storm while shopping for a porch swing. Ashley tried to laugh it off, calling my claims misunderstandings, and my memory convenient. And Brent suggested I was overwhelmed and should be grateful someone had the temperament to steer. But the realtor had already begun to slide her chair back because agents do not stay where liability lies, and the buyers apologized to Mom with soft voices, saying they were so sorry for the confusion, they loved the house but did not want to be part of anything that would hurt her, then excused themselves into the evening air where the sign looked suddenly less confident. When the front door closed, the quiet that followed was not empty, it was the space where people hear themselves honestly, and Mom turned to Ashley and asked, in a voice that shook with the strain of weeks, whether she had forged my signature and moved money without telling us and told strangers the house was hers to sell, and Ashley reached for the old soft phrases, protection, simplicity, responsibility, but they crumbled in her mouth. And when Mom whispered, "You lied to me," it landed like a verdict I would never have asked her to pronounce but needed to hear her say. We met the next morning at my attorney's office where formal notices waited like patient birds on a wire, the bank's freeze extended, the county alerted, the realtor withdrawing her listing with language so careful it might as well have worn a helmet, and we chose not to press criminal charges because Mom asked me, eyes bright with relief and exhaustion, to let the system correct the structure without knocking down the whole block. And I said yes, because justice is sometimes repair rather than demolition, and because I am my father's son. Ashley stopped calling for a while, and when she finally did it was to say she needed time to think, which is what people ask for after they spend yours carelessly, and Brent drifted out of the picture like a man stepping backward out of a photograph he never belonged in, and the house remained ours, not because of a victory I could frame for strangers but because a story I refused to accept as inevitable yielded to a slower, truer one I built in daylight. In the weeks that followed, I changed the porch bulb, resealed a window that had developed a draft, replaced a tired length of gutter, and every small fix felt like a stitch in a fabric that holds more than weather back. And in the evenings Mom and I sat where Dad used to, the rocking chair complaining in its familiar voice, cicadas winding up like old clocks. And sometimes she would say she was sorry for doubting, and I would tell her that being tired is not a sin and wanting peace is not a weakness, and that love, when it is honest, will outlast anyone's paperwork. I keep a copy of the recorded deed with the investigator's letter in a folder labeled simply House, not as a trophy but as a reminder that quiet work can stand against loud fraud, that patience is not passivity, and that you do not shout nails into wood, you set them with care and drive them straight so the frame holds. And when I look out across the yard where the for sale sign once swayed, I feel the steadiness of something rebuilt not in anger but in truth, and I know the story I will tell. If anyone ever asks how we kept our home, we listened longer than they lied, we wrote it all down, and when the time came we spoke softly and brought everything. And if there is any revenge in that, it is the kind I can live with, the kind that leaves the house standing, the porch light on, and the door opening to the right key again.